Retomando nossas atividades, lembramos que a palestra a seguir será apresentada em inglês. Portanto, se você sentir necessidade do fone de tradução, nós estamos distribuindo esses fones próximo à escada rolante, bastando levar um documento de identidade com foto. Princípios e boas práticas atuariais. Este é o tema do próximo painel, que terá como palestrante a senhora Carla City, atuária sênior da Principal Financial Group. Como debatedora, convidamos ao palco a senhora Celina da Costa Silva, responsável pela área técnica e atuarial da Brasil Prev Seguros e Previdência. Com a palavra, Celina da Costa Silva.
Bom dia a todos. Estou super feliz de ver esse auditório cheio. E a Carla está aqui para falar de princípios e boas práticas atuariais. Eu vou falar sobre o currículo dela. Ela é atuária sênior da Principal Financial Group, com sede em Des Moines, em Iowa. A Carla tem licenciatura em Matemática e Química pelo Culver Stockton College, e ela é Fellow of the Society of Actuaries, Member of the American Academy of Actuaries, and Chartered Financial Analyst. A Carla tem 13 anos de experiência na Principal Financial Group, dos quais os últimos anos ela passou trabalhando em empresas internacionais na América Latina e na Ásia. E o foco do trabalho dela é em modelagem e gestão de riscos. Então, com vocês, Carla City.
Bom dia a todos. From here in English only. So, sorry about that, but maybe it will be good practice for English listening. So, thank you for the introduction, Selena. And today my topic is actuarial standards and how they apply specifically to modeling work. Modeling work is very broad, and part of the reason there's more and more emphasis on modeling is the increase in uses of internal models and the governance and controls that need to be used around those if you're going to think about using models for financial reporting, for reserving, for even capital requirements. So I'll start with giving some background of actuarial standards in the US. From there, I'll talk about what specifically applies to modeling, and then more generally, what are we talking about with models and model risk, and how to manage that in a practical way. So in thinking about professionalism, so the root word of that is profession, and I was looking at what's the definition of a profession, and there are some common characteristics of a profession, including technical knowledge, standards around the profession, and I found a list of the earliest professions in the US, and I found it very interesting, so I'll go through it in order. Surveying, this is land surveying, which you can imagine with a country that's new, there would be a lot to do in that. Medicine, we're all very familiar with that as a profession. And actuarial science was actually third in the list of recognized professions in the US. And there's a long history of the need for this, going back probably 200 years to some of the earliest technical standards. And so there's a very strong element of professionalism and regulation around the actuarial science and actuaries as a profession. Other ones mentioned law, dentistry, civil engineering, logistics, which started with shipping, architecture, and accounting. So this is just to get a sense. Sometimes we think more of law or medicine as professions, but really this would put actuarial science and what we do as actuaries right up there with those other professions in terms of recognition, at least in the US. So what does it mean to be a professional? So some things come to mind with this. First of all, expertise. So we all have training in actuarial principles, mathematical knowledge, life contingencies, how to manage statistics, how that applies in using the law of large numbers in a practical way. So every profession has some base of expertise by which you become qualified to practice. There's also a strong element of professional judgment. And this is a phrase we see a lot in the actuarial standards because in the real world, it's not so easy as on an exam where you're given exactly the data to use. So in the real world, there's a lot of judgment involved in choosing what data to use, assumptions to set, what models to use, or what formulas are appropriate. And there's an important element, too, of recognizing other people's professional judgment and the understanding that people, educated people with maybe common education can reach different conclusions looking at the same information and data. And there's an important recognition of this in the US professional standards of respecting and recognizing someone's professional judgment. There's typically an element of status involved with being a professional, so things like getting to come to a conference like this, as well as just recognition by the public at large, perhaps recognition by regulators for the need to set standards. And although actuaries are not as well a known profession as maybe medicine or law, there is a status associated with it. There is a barrier of entry, if you will, by virtue of the education we receive and perhaps the tests we have to take to become qualified. There's also professional literature, and this is partly how we become educated, and it's partly how we extend our education and keep up to date. So there are, at least in the US, actuarial magazines and textbooks and various ways to educate yourself or to get continuing education. For example, with the designations I have, I am required to get 30 hours per year of continuing education. And that could include coming to a conference like this, for example. There are other ways, less structured and formal, that might include reading or personal study, but continuing education is a very important element of staying up to date and being informed about what's going on in the environment. And finally, professional conduct, which is what I'll talk about next, in terms of how in the US our conduct is not regulated externally, but basically self-regulated within the profession. And that's fairly common as well, I would say, that most professions want to hold themselves to a high standard. There may be external requirements in terms of demonstrating that you're qualified to practice, but we also as a profession want to hold ourselves to a high standard and be good representatives of the actuarial profession. So in the US, the body of professional standards are published by the American Academy of Actuaries. In the introduction, Selena mentioned that I'm a member of the American Academy of Actuaries, and that basically says I'm going to be held by the rules of professional conduct that the Academy formulates. And there are two key elements of this. There's a code of professional conduct, and it basically sets out what standards of behavior are appropriate, and I actually brought with me, just in case you're thinking, oh, this must be a long document, textbook or something. It's actually quite small, so it's a thin document, 7 pages, and there are 14 precepts that cover things like do what you're qualified to do, manage conflicts of interest appropriately, work with others professionally. So a lot of very common sense things, but when there is a complaint filed with the Academy of Actuaries, this is what they come to evaluate whether there might be something that would be grounds for a disciplinary action there. There are also actuarial standards of practice. Since we love acronyms, we call them ASOPs. And these lay out, in a slightly more technical way, standards for how to practice with regard to methodology or appropriate ways to do your work on a day-to-day basis. So this is more practical, more technical, and deals more with particular processes. I've listed for both the code and the ASOPs references where you could find these if you're interested in reading more about them. So I'll talk specifically about the standards, the ASOPs that are applicable to modeling work. There are about 50 ASOPs, and they were put out in order, so you can tell the newer ones because they're higher numbered. And there are a couple of ASOPs that are applicable basically to anything actuaries do. The first is data quality, and actuarial communications also applies to pretty much any forum in which you're communicating your results. I'll talk more in detail about these on the next slides. There's also new guidance coming out specific to enterprise risk management, and this is a growing field. So ERM is very prevalent now, very much discussed, and actuaries don't want to be left out. So there are many professions who have expertise in risk, in investment risk, for example. There are, might have an MBA. The CFA, which is a designation I also hold, relates to investments. And actuaries want to be there also. We have a long history of managing risks, actuarial risk, like mortality, policyholder behavior risk, incidents of death and disability. But we also want to be part of the ERM world, which takes a more holistic approach to risk management and takes the perspective of thinking from a company perspective and thinking about risk to the organization beyond just the traditional mathematical, statistical perspective. And then lastly, there's an exposure draft on modeling specifically that is addressing the increasing use of models, and particularly internal models. And I'll go through each of these in a little more detail now. For data quality, and I should comment that when you read the ASOPs, it seems like a lot of common sense. It seems like things that you know you should do, but you need reminders of these. And it's also something to be aware of because these standards are something, at least in the US, that we're held to. So if we don't follow these and our judgment is in some way called into question, whether it's a litigation case or you're working perhaps with a consultant and you have a disagreement, if you do deviate dramatically from these principles, it puts you in a more difficult situation in terms of justifying your professional judgment. So it's important to be aware of the guidance and to ensure that you're acting appropriately with regard to the standards. So on data quality, it's basically saying use appropriate data and document how you come to the conclusion that it's appropriate, document any changes you make in order to use the data. Very much document, and in particular document areas where you do use professional judgment to determine what data to use. On the topic of actuarial communications, this was a newer ASOP that was published 2 or 3 years ago and really raised the bar in terms of what actuaries do for reporting their findings. This ASOP basically says if you intend for your findings to be relied upon, and don't we all want our findings to be used and relied on, you basically need to write a report. It requires a more formal communication of your findings, including any limitations. So again, this is partly for the benefit of the actuary to say, make it clear how these results should be used, any limitations that would be inappropriate to use it for, and in that way, you're trying to control the use of your work and make sure that it's not used in a way that's inappropriate. When we talk about general standards of practice, sometimes people are surprised there is no ASAP on peer review. So peer review we recognize as an important element of validation of work, of just challenging the thought process, and of making sure that you have an end result that is really comprehensive, is well-founded. So there's no requirement to do peer review. And this strikes people as a little curious, and I think it's partly the Academy doesn't want to put us in a box in terms of saying, you must always do your work in a particular way. They do have a discussion paper that encourages peer review and recognizes it as a useful tool and one of a number of useful techniques you might use to ensure that you're meeting the highest professional standards. But you'll notice at the end of this it says, regardless of what you do, the preparing actuary has the responsibility to make sure your work product is appropriate and in compliance with the code. So even if you do have peer review, keep in mind it's still your responsibility, any work that you do, to ensure that it meets the highest standards. I mentioned a couple of new standards related to enterprise risk management. And these are really geared towards risk models and thinking about the increasing prevalence of internal models. So I know here in Brazil, for example, there are new regulations in course that would potentially allow use of internal models in capital setting. And these are the types of situations the standards are geared towards. There are two key elements. The first is whether a model is fit for the purpose. And this is just encouraging you to think through a process of what are we trying to accomplish, how could we best accomplish that, and does the model that we create or use meet that purpose? Is it appropriate? Is it capturing risk appropriately? And then the second key element is model assumptions and appropriateness of assumptions. We probably all are very familiar with assumption setting and the challenges of that, the difficulty of making a judgment. And so this isn't saying, giving you a particular guidance of what your assumptions should be. It's just saying, keep in mind that they should be appropriate. In this case, if it helps to have peer review, certainly do so, but it's still going back to, it's the responsibility of the preparing actuary to ensure that your work satisfies these guidelines. Some of the other things that you might consider in model appropriateness, the methodology, does it fit? Is the model, the data quality, again, thinking data quality underlies so much of what we do. And any model limitations that might restrict it from being useful if you're trying to extend this to other applications. So then finally, there is an exposure draft specifically on modeling. Again, geared towards the more that models are used, the more concern there was that these internal models be appropriately controlled and be managed in a way that is really compliant with the highest standards. I know at my company, for example, I've worked for the last 7 or 8 years on modeling with a software that we purchased from a vendor, building internal models. And with those models, which are mostly used for projections, the standards that we use are a little looser in terms of compared to what we do for financial reporting. When we do financial reporting, the processes are very strict, particularly in the US with the advent of Sarbanes-Oxley several years ago, that talks a lot about controls, making sure that your results are of the highest quality. Management signs off, in fact, on financial results and has the ability to be prosecuted should your financial statements be inaccurate. And so there's a lot of focus for financial reporting on accuracy of results, on making processes that are highly controlled. But when we do projections, when we're doing internal analysis, our processes haven't been as tightly controlled. We have a little more flexibility. We tend to do things more, we would say, on the fly. So you're making adjustments. You may not be thinking about I will have to come back and replicate this result. So a year or two down the road, when you are working on comparing results to a prior version, we've run into issues where we have version control. We aren't exactly sure which version was our final version. And this is just geared towards trying to really tighten up how that modeling work is done in preparation for internal models to be used for financial reporting or for capital setting. And one of the comments in here in the guidance is about mitigating model risk. And so that leads me to think, okay, what is model risk and how do you mitigate it? So first, what is a model? And the guidance is very broad on what a model is. It's in fact so broad that it applies to much of what we would do. So first of all, I'll talk about what a model is not. So this is a very well-known Brazilian model, but not the kind of model that we're talking about. And then we're also not talking about simple models that are maybe just a calculation that might just be, and this I tend to think of things like mortality tables and calculating mortality improvement factors and things like that. You certainly should check that work, but the models we're talking about really have an important element of estimation. There's uncertainty in the model itself, either in terms of the inputs, the structure, or the output. So this draft ASOP defines a model as a representation of real-world relationships. So statistical, mathematical functions are used to try to explain how the real world works, or at least capture in a realistic way some part of how the world works. And the ASOP uses these terms that I think are very strange for specification, implementation, and realization. To be honest, these aren't words that we use in the normal modeling world. I think that maybe they came more from a Solvency II type perspective. So I tend to think of these more as the parenthetical comments, the inputs, the formulas to define how the model works, and the outputs. So in a more visual way, this is what it's saying a model is. It has these important components where you have inputs, it could be data, it could be assumptions, it could even be qualitative factors rather than quantitative factors. Formulas, which then do the calculations. And when we think about models, we're thinking about internal models that you build, and that could be in Excel, it could be in a software, and it could also be vendor purchase models. So even if you purchase a model or purchase a software that does a calculation, this would say you as an actuary using this model have a responsibility to understand what the model's doing, even if you are not the one who wrote the formulas. And then outputs basically takes the inputs, does the calculations, and takes the estimates produced to do something. Hopefully it becomes useful business information that could be in the form of reports, graphs, a number or a range of numbers. But this is the basic concept of what a model is. And so you can see how this applies to many, many things that we do. A lot of actuarial work would be done in a model. So model risk is basically saying you can have adverse consequences because of how you use your model. It could be that your inputs are inappropriate. And a good example of this is in the US with the financial crisis, leading up to that financial crisis, one of the common assumptions was in the US, property values would continue going up. So for 20 years before the financial crisis, property values, real estate values had only gone up. And so there was an expectation that that's what would continue in the future. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that wasn't appropriate. In fact, property values went down dramatically. But many models that valued real estate assets were predicated on this assumption of increasing real estate values. It could be that your model is flawed. The calculations could be in some way wrong or inappropriate. Or you might use the model inappropriately. So another example from the financial crisis in the US is a lot of structured products, so complex products based on underlying assets, were created in the 5 or 10 years leading up to the financial crisis in 2008. And for a lot of these products, like collateralized debt obligations and some of these more complex, newer products, existing models were used because they thought they basically had the same characteristics. And it really wasn't until some of the underlying assumptions started to be violated that they realized these products didn't behave the same way as mortgage-backed securities at all. And the model that they'd been using, not only the inputs were inappropriate, but the model didn't really capture the structural behavior of these assets. So I'll give a couple of examples now of actual model risk at work. And so these examples come from fairly recent headlines. The London whale is, I think, a fairly well-known story of a trader in the London office of JP Morgan Chase who managed to basically single-handedly enter a large volume of credit default swap positions. When this first came to light in May 2012, they thought the losses would be around $2 billion US. Now the estimate is closer to 7 up to 9 billion. And actually, 2 weeks ago, the company announced that it was paying almost $1 billion in fines, separate from the losses, fines only, and penalties to regulators in the US and UK as a result of some of the violations in terms of securities trading rules. So there were a lot of things that went wrong with this particular incident. Most incidents like this, there's an element of operational risk in terms of lack of controls, people not spotting that this was happening. But there's also a very interesting element of model risk. So in a recent paper on this, which I found, and I've cited at the bottom, it's a short read and well written, it highlighted a couple things. One was the value at risk model they were using to analyze the risk of these CDS positions. It had a lot of copying and pasting. It was very manual. And even though the internal audit area had recommended that it be automated, it wasn't. And so there was still this very manual process which allows for human error. That aside, the real issue is in the second bullet point and bolded. So when this model was built, there was essentially a formula error. So to calculate the value at risk, instead of dividing by an average of two numbers, it was dividing by the sum of two numbers. So basically, the value at risk was muted or reduced by roughly 2. And so the value at risk was much lower than in fact it really was, or it appeared from this model to be lower. And so this is something that we look at and think, oh, you know, that surely was an obvious error. Again, in hindsight, I'm sure it seems very obvious. But there weren't the controls to catch this error. And this article that I read about it even pointed out, it's interesting that this error, which had the effect of muting value at risk, wasn't caught. But probably if the error had in fact multiplied value at risk by 2, it would have been caught. So sometimes if a model gives the result we expect or like, we're less likely to question it than if it gives us a result we don't like. And so the article was just pointing out we should maybe anticipate that in general our models will understate risk rather than overstate, because there's this natural bias to think risk is perhaps lower than it really is. So that was one example that was very recent. Another example that was fairly recent is related to an article by a couple of economists who published a paper called Growth in a Time of Debt. And these economists were both very well known in the US. They're both at Harvard, a very prestigious university. And their paper indicated that when they looked at the ratio of debt to GDP over time, that once you reached a certain threshold of greater than 90%, your economic growth, your GDP growth, basically fell off a cliff. It became negative. It was just a very bad situation for a country. And they used this to argue essentially for austerity. So you may recall after the financial crisis, a lot of governments were debating about whether to try to stimulate economies or to try to reduce government debt and government spending, and many chose austerity. So throughout Europe, even in the US, government spending was restrained, and in some cases, this was one of the papers they pointed to validate their belief, policymakers or regulators, the belief that too much debt was in fact negative in the long run. Well, earlier this year, another researcher who was trying to validate their findings found an interesting error in the Excel spreadsheet that they had used. And again, there are multiple things in this particular situation that could have been better. The researchers were not very forthcoming initially with their work, and so it was very difficult for other economists to validate, to either contradict or support their findings. So I think that speaks to the importance of peer review and of being open to that kind of challenge, effective challenge from others. And I think initially some people were hesitant to challenge them because Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt are very well known and well respected. And so if they weren't willing to consider effective challenge, it was more difficult for others to question their work. It was actually a graduate student at a different university who ultimately found this error, and it was quite embarrassing. Actually, the economists denied for a long time that there was any issue, and then finally when it became apparent, and partly because this actually found its way to the internet and made it very clear that in fact there were errors in their calculations. So partly I'm showing this because it really highlights how easy it is to make a mistake, and if you don't go through the process of review, of yourself reviewing, having someone else review, how easy it is sometimes to miss things like this. I also thought I'd show it since it seems a little strange to give a presentation without on an actuarial subject without numbers. So we can all appreciate here the Excel spreadsheet. And there were other issues with this as well. So the example highlighted here is just a simple formula error. They also chose not to weight the data. So you can see there are different periods of time included in the data here. And they just calculated a simple average rather than a weighted average. So there are various things that could be problematic in this. That in fact, when it ultimately came to light, was very embarrassing for the economists who published the paper. So thinking about managing model risk, the ASOP gives some specific things to focus on listed here. So validation, checking, analysis, governance, and controls are the types of things they highlight for managing model risk. So I'll talk more about validation. I think validation, checking, and analysis are all in some ways similar. But validation of a model is an important part to take the time to do well. And basically you're trying to make sure the model performs as you expected, keeping in mind that, as I just mentioned, your expectations could be biased in one way or another. So it's important to evaluate not just does the model produce the result you expected, but does it perform robustly if you use different combinations of assumptions, and not just does it give me the result I expected. Should also include evaluating the conceptual soundness. This is thinking about, if you think back to statistics and statistical testing, you're always supposed to have a hypothesis going in, right, to evaluate whether a statistical result verifies your hypothesis. So have a hypothesis and then evaluate, does the conceptual soundness of this model hold up when I do different scenarios, or when I use different assumptions, if I try to sort of stress the model. The guidance would also say validation should be ongoing, not just upfront. So if you're using a model regularly, then the validation should also occur regularly. The guidance is annually, although if there's a significant change, more frequently or on an ad hoc basis might be appropriate. And then outcomes analysis to compare what the model results show to, as much as you can, what happens in the real world. So a few examples of this type of validation, more specific examples. And this is thinking of my experience using particularly vendor software models. So one common one is just to validate your initial balances. So for example, if your model calculates reserves, you can compare the calculated reserves to your actual financial statement reserves and confirm whether you're matching within a reasonable degree. Backtesting is another useful way to validate a model. This would basically take a model, so to say I have a model as of the year in 2012, and I projected some result for 2013. Basically, I would take my assumptions for 2013, replace them with actual results, and see if the model could reproduce what actually happened in 2013, whether that's a reserve result or a financial statement projection of earnings. It could be a capital need, but basically trying to see if you use your actual results, can you replicate what happened? Comparing to other models, again, this seems like common sense, but if you have models that do cash flow projections, maybe you have a pricing model and a projection model and a reserving model, and they're all projecting benefit cash flows. Are you comparing the benefit cash flows in those different models to confirm that you're getting similar results? And if you do have a situation where you have a model that you might not fully understand, perhaps you didn't build it, it could be a vendor-provided model, or it could be a model that you received from someone else. And if you're not quite sure what's happening, it can be a useful tool to build a parallel calculator. So my team has used this, for example, a lot with asset cash flows, because the investment people we work with are not very familiar with the software we use and aren't very comfortable going in and running it. And so to get them comfortable with what the model is doing, we basically built a calculator in Excel that replicates the basic calculations. So they can look at the inputs, they can see the calculations, they can look at the outputs, and at the end, with all of that, finally, we can get them to say, yes, this model is doing what we think it should do. Then on the topic of governance, and this is more the general structure of model management and controls around how models are used. These are general principles that actually come not from the proposed ASOP, but from the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve in the US has some very robust guidance about model management. So they would say, for example, there should be oversight at the very highest levels of the company. So the board, if you're a publicly held company, you usually have an external board. You may have an internal board even if you're not publicly held. And senior management are ultimately accountable for results and for these models and for setting standards around model use. Those would be policies and procedures, formalized roles and responsibility, and typically some assessment by internal audit. I know at my company, internal audit is much more interested if we're using something for financial statements. That's usually their focus. But in recent years, they've also started to audit just internal models of all sorts. So some of the risk models that we use, and in the past had been mostly for analysis, these hadn't really been subject to internal audit until the last couple of years, and now the bar is being raised for basically all models. And I've highlighted the last couple because these are where I think as practitioners our responsibility is. So of course if the board, if management of companies sets particular roles and responsibilities, we have an obligation to follow those. But I think it's really more for us who are using models to make sure that we have a model inventory. This could be a list as detailed or as simple as you want, but do you know the models that you have at your company and the models that you as a group use? And then the completeness of model documentation and documentation of how models are validated is an area where there could probably always be improvement. The reality is documentation takes time. It's not the most fun part of our work to do. And for documenting professional judgment, it's even a challenge sometimes to think of, okay, what were all the ways I used to validate this and show that this was appropriate? But that's a very important step, not just from a governance perspective, but even for internally. I deal with turnover on my team, and to the extent we have good documentation, it's so much easier to bring in someone who's new to start using and improving a model. There are also some practical ways that you could address model risk in results themselves. So once you have a result, model risk is basically saying there's uncertainty in this result. And so there are ways you can present results to allow for that uncertainty. It could be presenting a range of results rather than a single number, just to show potential variability if key assumptions were varied. Another way is adding a provision for adverse deviation. We're very familiar with this in terms of like adding some provision to a mortality table for statutory reserves. But we've done that, in fact, with some of our internal risk metrics where we might add a provision for model risk at the end. After we've calculated everything, we might add an additional percentage just to say, we realize this is a model and there are some things we don't know what we don't know, basically. And then also, if you're doing modeling stochastically, there are some statistical ways to address variance in results. So for example, the CTE is conditional tail expectation. And this is a measure that you could use if you have a distribution of stochastic results, and the CTE 95, for example, would be the average of all of the results from the 95th percentile to the end of the distribution. And it's a good way to capture variability in the tail. So a percentile is very much driven by one particular result or point on a curve. And this CTE takes into consideration all of the results in the tail. And there are statistical ways to calculate the variance of a CTE result. And I cite a couple of people who've written articles on this. But that's one way that you could show a confidence interval, for example, of your statistical CTE result. So I also have, just to wrap up in the last few slides, some practical tips that my team has found useful, particularly working in Excel. And so we've implemented some standards just around how we'll build models to make it easier to understand a model if you're opening a new file that someone else created, and also to improve documentation. So to start, we almost always have a tab in the file, the first tab, that is an intro or documentation tab that explains what the purpose is, how the file is used, and basically lays out, if you're opening this file for the first time, what do you do with it? As much as possible, group inputs and assumptions together in one place so that you're not hunting all over for all of the things that need to be updated. Using named cells and named ranges is also very helpful in this regard. So if you can choose from a drop-down box of named cells, it's much easier to quickly go to where you need to update your assumptions or where you can find results. Automating copying and pasting, this is going back to that example of the London whale. This was one of the things that their internal audit had highlighted as a risk. Anytime you're copying and pasting, there's a chance for manual error. And if you're doing it over and over again, it gets really hard to keep track of whether you've updated something or not. Other things, just hidden tabs or cells can be very, very misleading or very dangerous. So as much as possible, try to avoid those. And again, understanding a file, explain how the output should be used. If it goes directly as an input to something else, include a link or a file name or some explanation of how that output is ultimately used. On the topic of controls, again, more in Excel, you can use cell protection and file protection, password protection to avoid inadvertent changes, particularly if you provide a model to someone else to use and they should only be able to change a few things and see results. You can protect most of the file to avoid formulas being changed or key calculations being changed. Something that we use a lot is saving files as read-only once they're final. Again, trying to avoid inadvertent changes. Using consistent naming conventions and version number. These are geared towards version control, so my team works with a lot of different countries, different valuation dates, different types of scenarios, and so we have conventions that our file name should always include the country name or in some cases, the business entity name, the year or valuation date, whether the scenarios are deterministic or stochastic, and we use shortened things for this, but you should be able to tell from a file name exactly what it is if you use that type of convention. In terms of version history, having something right in the file is really the easiest way to keep track of changes made or prior versions, why you have so many versions of a file. And then finally, if you do have multiple files that all interact, you can use file linking in Excel, and there are views on that, whether it's a good idea or not. But if you do have a lot of files that interact, having some sort of process map or flowchart to show how they are used and where data from one file goes to another file can be very helpful. So those are just some of the practical tips in terms of controls. So I think with that, I'll wrap it up, and Selena, I'll ask you to make any comments, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Eu queria agradecer a Carla pela excelente apresentação. Ela começou aqui falando da importância do atuário, das responsabilidades que nós temos. Uma coisa que eu achei muito interessante é essa questão que lá nos Estados Unidos tem uma educação continuada, que os atuários são obrigados a ter 30 horas de educação continuada por ano. Eu acho que é uma boa prática, que a gente também deveria seguir essa prática. E essa educação continuada, ela vem de leitura, de cursos, de participação em eventos como esse aqui. A Carla também falou bastante dessa questão dos modelos, a responsabilidade que nós temos sobre esses modelos e o que a gente tem que fazer para evitar erros como esses exemplos que ela apresentou. Então, a gente tem realmente uma grande responsabilidade em como passar esses resultados, passar de uma forma bem assertiva, para não gerar uma má interpretação dos resultados. E, enfim, também é importante a gente saber como lidar com os erros do Excel, a questão da revisão dos pares, isso é uma boa prática, e por causa da Principal, a gente usa bastante essa revisão de pares lá na Brasil Prev. E a gente vai abrir agora para as perguntas, só que eu vou começar já com uma pergunta para a Carla. Nessa questão dos riscos, né, da modelagem, e, enfim, o próprio atuário faz uma série de testes para checar se o modelo está adequado. Mas uma coisa que eu queria saber, como é essa questão de uma certificação externa de um modelo lá nos Estados Unidos? Se isso é uma prática muito utilizada e como funciona essa certificação de modelos?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Selena. And in terms of model certification, the practice varies. There's no particular standard. And to some extent, it depends on the use of a model. So as an example, my company has a product for which we get reserve financing. So essentially, an investment bank gives us a letter of credit and says, if you need additional capital, we'll provide it to you. And it allows my company to hold less capital. And for that particular application of a model, this analysis is based on an internal model, but because there are actual capital implications, because we're getting a guarantee from an investment bank that they'll provide capital, they want to be very comfortable with our model. And so in that case, we hire an external consultant to review our model and basically provide some comparison to model standards to their expectations, and we do get essentially a certification of that model. But for other applications of the model, there's no particular requirement, so there's no universal requirement, rather I should say, for having peer review or having an external review.
Ok, Carla, obrigada. Bom, então vamos abrir para perguntas. As perguntas devem ser feitas pelo microfone e eu peço, por favor, que quem quiser fazer perguntas levante a mão.
Bom dia, Celina. Bom dia, Carla. Aqui é o Alexandre Leal, sou da CNseg. Uma curiosidade, como é que é a vida do atuário nos Estados Unidos, você tendo reguladores por estado, né, uma empresa que eventualmente atue em diversas jurisdições, né, qual é o overhead de trabalho por você atender diversas eventuais situações distintas, né, para esses vários reguladores?
Thank you for the question. Certainly, we do deal with many different regulators as an international company. To a large extent, when we're thinking of regulation at a local or country level, we rely on the local operations to be the experts. And so, for example, Principal's relationship with Brazil Prev, we rely on Selena and her team to be experts on Brazilian regulations. That said, our home regulators and our home rating agencies, so US regulators and rating agencies, are very interested in being sure that we're holding adequate capital for the entity as a whole. And so certainly we, the US-based actuaries, have responsibilities to validate results, to ensure that we can understand at least enough to explain to US regulators and rating agencies how the rules are similar to or different from the US, in particular to help them get comfortable that any local requirements are appropriate and adequate.
Mais perguntas?
Good morning. I am Germano. I'm from a company called Neurotech. I was wondering if you could comment a bit more about what are the state-of-the-art techniques that are being used in the US at the moment for analyzing data, for modeling risk, statistics, and gathering internal data and external data for modeling risk.
Yeah, so I'll answer that on a couple of fronts in terms of modeling risk, or risk modeling perhaps. So in the US, one evolution that's driving this is the increase in interest from regulators and interest from rating agencies even to allow us to use internal models. So, for example, reserves have typically been very rule-based in the US, and now will become more principles-based. So each company will be allowed to use their own experience to set reserves. But as you can imagine, this creates a big burden in terms of the analysis and documentation of your experience and then of your model itself. So a few, as far as tools or software, we find increasing use of tools to manage a lot of data. So for example, as a company, we've migrated from using Microsoft Access very heavily to instead use SAS, which is the software that allows us to manipulate a lot of data very efficiently, and much more quickly, in fact, than Access can. We're also moving from Excel-based models to more software-type models. So there are many vendor softwares that can handle asset and liability calculations. And so we use a software that basically makes those calculations much quicker and more controlled than in Excel. So I don't know if that addresses your question or if you have further comments on that.
Mais perguntas?
It does address my question. Thank you very much.
Mais perguntas?
My name is Paul. Carla, you've been talking about external accidents with model errors. Could you share with us the worst case you have encountered? Doesn't need to be recent, could be more in the past, and how you've dealt with it and what were the results?
Yeah, so the question is about just model error and what an experience of mine. I think that, so I should start by saying nothing immediately comes to mind, which is not to say we haven't had errors, but there's no single error that has eclipsed all others in horror. So the thing that we run into the most has actually been just version control of models. And where this has arisen is working with, my team works with a lot of different countries, a lot of different models. And so, for example, a year or so ago, we had stepped in to basically take over work for a modeler in Chile who was out of the office on an extended medical leave. We took what we thought was the current version of the model. It was not, in fact, the current version of the model, and used that for our analysis. The results we got were not terribly wrong, but they weren't right either. And so that, for us, was a good reinforcer of the difficulty in version control when you have a lot of different models, when you're communicating with different people, different offices. And so the error in our results was maybe 5 or 10% error from what the estimate should have been. It was not, something we couldn't overcome. And we also have the benefit that we're adding up results. When my team looks at results, we're adding up results of many companies in different countries, and you get some offsets. But it was certainly uncomfortable to have to explain, no, the results we gave you before actually weren't correct. These are the more correct results, and explain why, in fact, we were using a combination of different valuation dates and different data.
Bom, nós vamos ter que encerrar. Queria agradecer a presença de todos em nome da CNseg, da Escola Nacional de Seguros, agradecer a Carla pela excelente palestra e lembrar a todos que amanhã vai ser distribuída uma ficha de avaliação e que é super importante que todos preencham essa ficha para que a gente possa continuar fazendo esses eventos de alta qualidade. Obrigada a todos.
Obrigado, Carla. Obrigado, Celine. Nós as convidamos para que, por favor, se acomodem no auditório para darmos sequência, então, às atividades do nosso encontro.